today what I want to do is discuss how theology in the 21st century is different to what it was for the past 2,000 years. We'll work through that. We'll have a look at why this is so, what are the dangers posed or faced by youth in particular during this 21st century era that we're in. I'll give some examples of that. Then I'll work my way through to showing visually the relationship between God, mankind, and the animal kingdom, and in fact, indeed, the whole universe. Following that, we will have a look at some actual data of how the Christian faith is declining, specifically in Australia, but really worldwide. And that decline can be addressed, but clergy and parents have to know how to go about doing this. So, young parents and clergy in particular need to understand that what we are discussing now is a vital part of 21st century theology. What that means is that young parents and clergy must be able to converse with their children at this level. Why? In order to save the souls of your children and their children. That's why. Conventional theology alone can't do that. It's not that conventional theology is irrelevant. Certainly it is relevant and must be relevant, but it's not sufficient. Look, I might give a very hypothetical example. For the past, certainly 20 years, maybe more, 30 years, there are many experiments have been done with what are called hybrid human animals. So scientists have been creating combined human pigs, human mice, human rats, and you name it. They would experiment with that, and then after 14 days, these so-called monsters would then be killed, destroyed. And that process has been going on and on and on. Probably 5 years ago, they got to the stage where a mouse had 50% of its brain was human. This actually frightened even atheist scientists as to why they're going down this path. They were not sure how the mouse would react, if it would show human qualities. And they said as soon as that would happen, they had to kill that mouse on the spot. So now, where I'm leading up to, again, hypothetical. Say a mother gives birth to a child, and the child has got some sort of a biological brain defect, a problem in the brain. And the doctors tell the mother, we can create extra cells from animals and inject those cells somehow into the brain, and the baby will be fine. And the mother happens to be Orthodox, and that's all fantastic. She goes to the priest and he gives a blessing. What is not made clear usually, would be that the cells from the animal are also embryonic in nature, so they in themselves could grow up into a mouse or whatever it is. So you now have a human hybrid, and that is the destruction of humanity. I remember very, very early in my priesthood once reading various laws about baptism in the church, and there was a phrase that I remember to this day, and that phrase says that a priest must never baptise a monster. And all these years I understood that to mean a very severely deformed baby. And it's not true. They didn't really know what it is they were prophesying, but the monster is in fact a human-animal hybrid. And then you can go further, you can go down the path of machine-brain interfaces, experiments going on there. So clergy in particular, because they look after parishioners, but also parents have to understand that this dehumanising process is part of our theology, our spiritual life. It has to be addressed, and you can't address it by talking about heresies and what happened in the Old Testament. So this is why we're looking at a new era here. The spiritual warfare in the 21st century has changed to such an extent that it's now beyond recognition. It appears to have no relationships with theologies as we knew them previously. And what makes this so dangerous is that what we're dealing with is really stealth spiritual missiles, possibly armed with nuclear warheads. Meanwhile, the church and its parishioners are trying to save their children by using bows and arrows. That's the difference. And so it's not simply a case of this is all nice to know stuff and then we put it aside. No, we have to address this stuff and make that part of an extension of conventional theology. The Australian census data shows that since 2006, Christians have been abandoning their faith at a very rapid rate. What's more disturbing is that youth, people, I can't remember the exact ages, but it's something like perhaps 18 through to perhaps maybe 30 years of age, the young people, their faith has been plummeting since that time. And we'll have a look at actual figures later on. So in this talk I'll be focusing on how modern atheism uses science and philosophy to convince society, and in particular to convince youth to abandon their faith. For the past 2,000 years, spiritual warfare was essentially concerned itself about beliefs and teachings of the church. In other words, the enemy was heresy. So the church for all this time struggled with heresies of all types, and so hence you had your 7 ecumenical councils in particular to address the very major issues. Now things have changed to such an extent where atheistic society in our era onwards no longer cares about what the church teaches. It doesn't care about heresies. The target is God himself. Now, since God cannot by definition be destroyed, what do atheists do? They take a different path. They try to make him appear irrelevant, that he's not required. And that's the same, then that equates to him not existing. And this is where excuse me, science and philosophy kick in. Before continuing, I want to emphasise that this talk is not anti-science. On the contrary, my previous talk back in May, I stressed that science is in fact theology. So this whole thing is very complex, and what I want to do is look at one step at a time and then link these up together. And so there are fundamentally 9 steps that I've identified. And the first step is that Orthodox youth are not immune from social trends and ideologies because Orthodox youth are part of society. They were born in this society, they were raised, and are different to non-Christians, and so they're affected in the same way. So if society can convince today's youth that God is obsolete, many of them will abandon their Christianity. despite being raised as Orthodox kids. And when that happens, conventional theology fails, and souls may very well perish. I must add, however, that this is not a foregone conclusion, because we're talking basically about what's happening in the world, but there's God at the other end, and he doesn't want people to die. And so he, of course, will do his bit. Nevertheless, we must be aware of what's going on and act accordingly. What makes this current situation super dangerous is that the youth, once they're convinced, they will be rejecting God voluntarily. That's the key here. Although God does the actual saving of souls, he cannot do this without our cooperation. He can't force people to be saved. So if they rebel against him, reject him, it makes it incredibly difficult for him to do the saving bit. He can still do it, but nevertheless, we need to understand that. And just to emphasise that bit, I will quote from the Gospel. So you'll see it's not an exaggeration. We find in Matthew, Jesus explains, he says this, "Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I also confess before my Father. I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." So when people voluntarily deny God, that's the problem. That's Jesus himself speaking. So, summarising, step one, voluntary rejection of God is the number one problem. Step two. So, what has happened since 2006 that is causing this rapid decline in belief? There are various reasons, but right at the top is a new movement that has appeared on the scene, and that's called New Atheism. It consists of high-profile atheist scientists and philosophers, such as Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, Lawrence Krauss, very active in this area, and again the late Stephen Hawking, the famous scientist. That's just to name a few. They relentlessly attack religion by portraying atheism as an extension of science, whereas in reality there is no connection between atheism and science. Newton's law of gravity, for example, functions just fine without any atheism. The moon orbits the Earth with no atheism involved. However, if there was no God, there would be no atheism, because atheism is anti-God. And so atheism, in fact, is not related to science, it's related to theology. But that's not what the world understands. I also want to now clarify that atheism comes in three different flavours, meaning there are three different types of atheists. At the basic level, you have simply those atheists who don't believe in God, and that's it. Then you have the dogmatic atheists. They refuse to look at evidence which points to God, but that's sort of their level. Then you have those whose mission is to attack God, and that's the new atheists that we're talking about. They're the aggressive ones. And they use their brand of philosophy masquerading as science to deceive people. So, new atheism propaganda is based on deception. That's why it's dangerous. I want to give just a couple of examples of both of the dogmatic atheists and then the aggressive atheists. So I will actually quote. Last year there was a debate between two professors. One was Professor Emeritus Peter Allen, who's an atheist from Oxford University. The other one, and he debated John Lennox, also Professor Emeritus of Mathematics and Philosophy, also from Oxford University. Both were asked a question from the audience, and the question was this: what new evidence would be sufficient to lead the speakers to adopt the opposite point of view? So the question was, what would convince an atheist that God exists, and what would convince a theist that God does not exist? That's the question. Peter Allen, he then replied to the question, and he said, I simply can't think of any evidence. I tell myself that if I agreed with some evidence, then it showed that I've simply gone mad. Then the moderator said, are you saying your position is unfalsifiable? I can discuss this falsifiable bit later on in Q&A or something. However, what it means in a couple of words is science must be falsifiable, the theory. If a theory is not falsifiable, it means it's not science. So I'll repeat the moderator's comment. Are you saying your position is unfalsifiable? Means, are you saying your position is not scientific? That's what the moderator is asking Peter Allen. And Peter Allen replies and says, yes, because if I was standing at the foot of the cross and saw the resurrection before my very eyes, I would put it down to hallucination. Right. So this is dogmatic atheism. Science demands that all evidence, no matter where it leads, must be considered objectively. What this example shows, however, is that even very serious scientists like Peter Allen will refuse to accept evidence that clashes with their dogmatic beliefs. Okay? Now, also, okay, I've discussed the falsifiable bit, and just to add to that, so this dogmatic concept shows that it makes a mockery of the accusation that atheists make against religious believers that religion is based entirely on faith and not on evidence. And here we have a world-renowned chemist, Professor Emeritus, saying that's exactly what he does, because it clashes with his atheistic beliefs. No difference. Two examples from new atheism now. The first guy is Richard Lewontin. He's an evolutionary biologist from Harvard University. I quote him, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs." So sometimes science says dumb things. And he says, well, we'll still go down that path, accept that, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. Now listen, he continues and says, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So unlike Peter Allen, who was a dogmatic atheist, he just simply said, this is what I believe, this is how I would react personally. This guy, Richard Lewontin, goes further. He says, it's not what I believe, that's not what he says. He says, we will not allow science to address these issues. Won't allow a divine foot in the door if there is such evidence. So you can see where we're going. And so, in other words, Peter Allen is honest Lewontin is scientifically dishonest. Now here comes the doozy. A quote from Richard Dawkins. This is so overwhelming that I can't pronounce half the words. We'll see how we go. Quote, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, I don't even know what that means, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously, malevolently bully." Now this is good old Richard Dawkins. He's probably the most renowned atheist in the world. That's his attitude. So he attacks God. Now here's the thing. Firstly, when he talks about, simply says that this God of the Old Testament is pure fiction, that's called a straw man argument. What that means is that you make a statement asserting that it's correct, and then based on that statement, you belittle that scenario. And that's what he's done. So we have the situation where he says it's all fiction, and he says in reality, God does not exist, and then he goes attacking viciously something that doesn't exist. So that's insanity. Why would you go bonkers attacking something that doesn't exist in public? But he's doing that. But clearly he's not insane. So what does that translate to? It means that he knows that God exists, and that's why he's attacking God. You don't go attacking something that doesn't exist. That's just ridiculous. I'll further add that Richard Dawkins, he wrote a book called the God Delusion. In that God Delusion book, it's fairly recent, he says, no scientist can really say that something doesn't exist, that God doesn't exist. So, this is him talking. He says, on a scale of 7, I consider the probability of God not existing being 6. 6 out of 7, God does not exist using his probabilities. So what he's saying is that 1 in 7 chance that God does exist. Now, that's sort of roughly like 13% probability that God exists. Now, his probabilities have got nothing to do with reality, but that's how he sees things. So he acknowledges that something like 13% in his mind, God is real. And that's a mighty big probability. When people buy lottery tickets, you're talking probabilities 1 in a million or something. Here's 13%, for goodness sake, and he's prepared to put his life at stake. He's prepared to sacrifice his own soul with such a whopping big probability. And that's because of hatred for God. I just want to show an unusual example, the lengths to which atheists will go. And again, of course, it involves Richard Dawkins here. He was instrumental back in January 2009 to set up what's called the Atheist Bus Campaign to attack God publicly. And so there were 800 buses travelling around in London for, for a year or two with this big sign saying, I'll show you in a second, advertising, the sign said, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy life." So here is a picture. So, is that visible? Okay, that's the sign there, you can see. And so 800 buses like this. They also approached 15 other countries worldwide, America, UK, Russia, would you believe, a whole slave of other countries, and they essentially all rejected this attempt. Richard Dawkins explained that if they simply said there is no God on the slogan, that would be equivalent to a religious statement. But by including the word probably, that puts it in the realm of science. And that clearly is to deceive the public, because they don't believe probably doesn't exist. Atheism claims it doesn't exist. So that's the deception. There you go. All right. So that was step 2. Step 3. Why is new atheism so effective? In a word, it's because the people who are at the forefront of new atheism, they have a high reputation. Normally it's scientists, but there's philosophers as well. And their reputation is world-renowned. They are deep thinkers. And so, therefore, because of their status, then what they say clearly must be interpreted as being factual. And I just write down a series of points that the sort of tactics that they use. I'll read those out. Tactics new atheists use include claiming that the laws of nature can create the universe, that no creator is needed. Next one, claiming that there is no evidence for the existence of God without providing proof to substantiate that assertion. Ignoring evidence that does point to God. And I'll just make a one-line statement here. There's very powerful evidence that even atheist scientists grieve over, and that's called the fine-tuning of the universe. It's so finely tuned for life that it's just almost impossible to imagine how that could have happened without a creator. We'll sort of discuss that a bit later. Next point, claiming, earlier I spoke of laws of nature. Now there are things called constants of nature. There are about 26 of those. So they claim that the constants of nature can be explained scientifically, and they really cannot. I won't discuss this further because of time constraints. Further, claiming that faith without evidence only applies to believers, and yet we just saw before. That's not true. Often they will pose a question, and the question is, when they're arguing against God, they will say, who created God? And it's as if by asking that question, they have already proved that God cannot exist because nobody created God. Next one, a loving God would not allow innocent suffering. That's a classical one. Further, belittling religious believers into submission, and that really affects the youth big time. Presenting conjecture as scientific fact, and the prime example of that is the multiverse, and I will discuss it in 2 weeks' time in more detail. Then, using biblical quotes falsely and out of context. 2 more. Proclaiming that all things supernatural are fiction, fairyland stuff. We'll cover that here. And the last bit that I wrote, noticed, they argue that God created evil. Yet not one of these claims is scientifically true. They're all lies. So that's step 3. All right, step 4. With that preamble that we just went through, we need to ask the question, why is science necessary in theology? The short answer is because Jesus deemed it necessary. Jesus revealed his divinity using science. What do you think about that? Next, definition of science. What is science? There are multiple definitions, but the most fundamental definition is that, at the simplest level, science is the study of nature, specifically how the laws of nature work. That is science. What's the difference between science and philosophy? Scientific theories must be confirmed by observation. They see things happening in nature and they decode this as laws of nature. Without observation, no theory can be scientific. Philosophy, on the other hand, draws its conclusions based on rational analysis, but there's no evidence, there's no proof. Observation, however, is not restricted just simply seeing with the eyes. It's in fact, very often it involves measurement. And this is how scientists investigate what happens at the microscopic level, where particles are so small that they physically cannot be seen visually. And so they do experiments, and then they what constitutes proof is statistical analysis. So if statistically there are so many events that occur, then at a certain level that constitutes proof in science. So in a nutshell, science is a study of how nature works. If you can't see it or measure it, it's not science. Conversely, if you can observe nature behaving in a certain way, that is scientific, irrespective of whether that behaviour appears to be normal or not. In fact, at the microscopic and submicroscopic level, that's called quantum mechanics, every scientist involved in quantum mechanics acknowledges and says that nothing at that level makes sense. And that is a fact. So that means that at this atomic, subatomic level, nature, according to our understanding, behaves abnormally. So being abnormal behaviour in nature is normal. You might see where I'm heading towards Christ's miracles. Jesus used science, I mentioned before, to prove his divinity. That means that he had power over nature. Nature obeyed him. People could see, they observed nature obeying Jesus. And that observation is the same as what scientists do when they observe nature behaving. Had Jesus not demonstrated his divinity this way, and he only went around telling people, I can resurrect dead people. But he never showed that, he never did that. What do you think would happen? He would be believed, they would not believe him. And that, of course, makes sense. So it had to be shown. That is step 5. Step 6. How did Jesus use science? Again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but by performing what we call miracles. But miracles, what are miracles? Miracles have 2 parts. There's a natural part and a supernatural part. And that's the thing that nobody seems to understand. If we take the simplest example that I could find in the Gospel, and this is where Jesus was walking with his disciples and he saw a fig tree, and the fig tree didn't have any fruit. So he cursed the fig tree, and the fig tree then died. And so the death of the fig tree was natural. Fig tree lived, it was natural, it died, it was natural. That can be confirmed by observation, hence scientifically. What can't be confirmed is the reason, or what can't be analysed rather, is the reason why the fig tree died. And the reason is because Jesus cursed this. So the bit I'm getting at here is that people saw laws of nature obeying Jesus, even with that little simple example. So likewise, when a person was healed by Jesus, he was still the same person. Physically, his molecules were the same, and so was his soul. There was no miracle molecules in him after he was healed. So when Jesus healed people, the healing itself was not supernatural. What was supernatural was the cause of the healing, and that cause was Jesus himself. Now here's the rub. Scientists can investigate the natural part of the miracle, but they can't investigate the supernatural cause. Nature and cause. Cause, supernatural. Nature is still nature. Like in the quantum realm, nature does all sorts of crazy stuff. Here, people saw nature behaving differently. That was still natural. Okay? And so that's one bit. The other bit is that people were also able to see that the nature behaved in response to Jesus, and that Jesus says something happens. There is a statistical correlation between cause and effect. You can't analyse the cause, supernatural, but you can see that the supernatural cause produces a result. That is a statistical analysis that can be done. And so every time Jesus performed a miracle, we saw, every time the laws of nature obeyed him. There was a one-to-one correlation, irrespective of the type of miracle. And this is what Jesus wanted to show the world. So Jesus first performed miracles, showed that he was the boss of nature. Nature obeyed him, and only then, after he showed that, demonstrated to people worldwide, then he would ask people whether they had faith in his ability to heal them. He had to show first that he had that capacity, then asked. And so that means that faith was trust. Do you trust me that I can heal you? Okay? So, summary of just a very quick summary. Step 6, miracles have two parts, natural and supernatural. The natural part can be separated from the supernatural part, and the natural part can be studied scientifically. Step 7, we're getting towards the end of the talky bit, then I'll show the diagrams. Atheists refuse to separate the natural from the natural. Why? Because that would undermine atheism and give credence to theology. And so what they do is they then place both components of the miracle into the supernatural category. Natural and supernatural, the whole shebang becomes supernatural, and then you can label that whole event as being theological speculation and problem is fixed. How do you like that? Alrighty. Now, going from there, I'll give an example. So, a classic example, Stephen Hawking, who's arguably was the world's most famous scientist of our time. He was interviewed by the Guardian newspaper in 2011, and there's just a quote from that. The report in the newspaper said, Hawking told the Guardian's Ian Sample that he believed there is no afterlife and that the concept of heaven is a fairy story for people who fear death. Okay? Fairy story. Yet people don't see it that way. Those who are not religious, they actually want to hear this sort of stuff, especially from somebody of Hawking's stature. Because if they hear that Hawking said there is that heaven is a fairy story, and so that means there's no afterlife, and so to them, hearing that from Hawking is the same as Hawking proving to them that there's no afterlife. It's his authority as a scientist which confirms what he says, even though what he's saying is a falsehood. That's the issue. Now, Hawking here represents the atheistic scientific world, and that world severely impacts on society and on what society believes. And the problem then is that if in general society believes what Hawking and company and Dawkins and the rest say, if they believe that as being scientific in nature, then unfortunately youth believe that as well, and that's where they get sucked in. Okay, now step 8, we have 9 steps. This brings us to the most important question of all. How important is science in theology? Okay, so we're differentiating theology for 2,000 years, new era, science. How important is that? I will let Jesus explain. There are 2 quotes from the Gospel. I actually used these quotes in my earlier lecture, and I'll repeat that again because it's very important. In John, we read, "Now, when John heard in prison about the deeds of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and who said to him, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" So the disciples, John's disciples, have asked that question of Christ. And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." Jesus showed in that quote that I just did exactly what we were talking about before, that the laws of nature obey him. And so the people who saw these miracles were no different to scientists observing how nature behaves in our time. Indeed, there is no difference. And actually, I will add that cosmologists, everything that they see in the universe happened from millions to billions to 13 billion years ago. It's stuff that happened in the past. So people carrying on about miracles happening 2,000 years ago, they haven't got a clue. Right, last bit. This brings us to an even more important revelation. In John, Jesus says, "If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. If I had not done among them the works that no other man did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen and hated both me and my Father." All right, we will now be looking at some diagrams behind me. In a second, what I'll just before that mention that we will be discussing the relationship between Jesus, or God, and humanity, and I refer to the animal kingdom, but it really means the whole universe itself. Okay, I want to now show a few things pictorially. It's just easier to understand when you see some diagrams. There's a bit of stuff there, but none of it is complex. And that's the biggest size I could do on a home front. So I'll describe what happens. First, we'll look at the created world when Jesus created Adam and Eve. So that one here. At that stage, and this is before Adam and Eve sinned. So you have God at the top, you have Adam and Eve here, and then you have the created world. There's always a gap, a distance between God and man, even the most pure man. Sinless man, there's still a distance. Here on this chart, I called it A1. It's A, but we'll see why A1. A varies. That distance can vary. It varies with sin. As we sin, we fall away from God. But the distance between humanity, mankind, and the animal kingdom, that distance does not vary. I call it B. It never varies because animals don't sin. And humans who are made rulers of the created universe, they always have to be higher than the created universe because they are made in image of God. Okay, so what we've got, A, I'll repeat, distance between God and man. B, distance between man and animal kingdom. The distance between God and animal kingdom and nature is that A plus B in this case. Now what I've done, just to make it easier to understand so you're not talking algebra, if say that was, distance between man and God was 15 kilometres, and the distance between man and animals was 10 kilometres. So, distance between God and the animal kingdom is 15 kilometres plus 10 kilometres. In the ideal world, originally, the animals were 25 kilometres away, symbolically speaking, okay? Now we go to the fallen world. The big deal here is, you notice A1 was little, A2 includes the natural separation between man and God, that's there, plus the sin. So the more we sin, the bigger the separation. A has grown, but B remains the same. So in this one, I'll give some figures. Here, A was 15 kilometres. Now it's grown to 50 kilometres, 50. But that remains 10. 10, because they don't sin. So now the animal kingdom is 50 plus 10 is 60 kilometres distance between nature, between animals and God. Previously it was 25 kilometres. Now it's 60 kilometres, and that's, again, I emphasise, nothing to do with the animal kingdom. They must be subservient to their rulers, us. We fall, they fall. Okay? And it can't be the other way around. Say, logically speaking, if somebody thought, well, why should animals be punished because of sinful man? Why? Because sinful man, nevertheless, is still in God's image. And if animals were not punished, if their relationship to God was fixed no matter what, you would end up here where eventually animals are higher than man, their ruler. Meaning animals are higher than God's image. That doesn't work. It can't work. So nature, the whole universe, nature and its laws depend upon the spiritual state of man. Okay, this is our final drawing here. This is probably harder to see, but again, that's what I had to work with. This is a graph based on data obtained from the 2006 census, 2011 census, 2016 census, and next year will be the other census. And what this graph is, it shows on the vertical scale what percentage of Australia's population is or was Christian, believed in Christ, identified themselves as Christians. In 2006, 64% of the population said on the census that they were Christians. If you go back 2 decades, it's about like 90%. Doesn't matter. We're starting here. Then, 5 years later, it dropped from 64% to 61% of the population said they were Christians. 2016, 52%. The trend has started. And just by simply projecting, my guess is, conservatively speaking, that next year we'll see that the population will be below, that believes in God, the Christians, will be below 50%. I'm sort of guessing 43%. Now, here's the real big deal, why all of this is important. Until 2016, the believers weren't divided into age groups. So I've only got one data point for age groups. And what that says is that in 2016, although the average population, 52% of the average population believed in God as Christians, youth, young people, age group, 25 to 34 years of age, that group, only 38% call themselves Christians. General population 52, see that gap? And I'm guessing that next year, 30% of the age group, 25 to 34, will say they're Christians. And because Orthodox youth are part of that package, so you'll be seeing a decline, and we already see a decline of Orthodox youth abandoning their faith. And just to put that in an approximate perspective, what that means is a young family, a family who has 2 children, statistically only speaking, one of those will abandon their faith and perish. That's what we're talking about. Whether it's 50% of your children perish or 20%, the fact is they will abandon their Christian faith. And conventional theology can do nothing about that, because if it could do something about that, then that wouldn't happen. It's happening. So we have to now address the issue seriously. The church has to, clergy have to, young parents have to. They have to speak the same language as their kids. Okay, we'll finish in about 2 minutes flat, I think. I'll quote again Jesus in Matthew, and this refers really to our time right now. Jesus says, "For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended." How do you like that? I'll continue. "Many will betray one another and hate one another." Pestilences, what does that mean? Epidemics, pandemics, diseases, plagues, viruses. We saw on our graph before plummeting of Christianity, meaning God is being abandoned. God then says in Matthew, "When the time comes when society abandons me, this is what you'll have, your pestilences." And what have we got? COVID-19. Right. Now, to end on a positive note, again a quote from Matthew. "When his disciples heard it, they were greatly astonished, saying, 'Who then can be saved?' But Jesus looked at them and said to them, 'With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible.'" End of story, end of my presentation for today. Next time it becomes more scientific and I think exciting.